We're going to continue in Genesis. So we are in Genesis chapter 39. So this is message number 40 in this series entitled The Hebrew Slave. We are in Genesis chapter 39, and so to begin, I'll read verses 1 and 2. And Joseph was brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him of the hands of the Ishmaelites, which had brought him down thither. And the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. So chapter 38 seems to just intrude into the Joseph story that begins in chapter 37 and is the main storyline as you go through the end of Genesis in chapter number 50. But rather than an intrusion or a digression, we saw how that chapter 38 establishes Judah as a secondary plot line in this section of Genesis, and how that both stories, the story of Joseph and the story of Judah, are connected and they're running together, and they resolve together by the end. And both of the stories are about the saving of Israel. Joseph's is a little more immediate in the saving of Israel, and Judah's is a little more future in those terms. Now, the structure and the execution of chapter 38 as a narrative account of Judah's family clearly belongs in Genesis, and it is placed properly. The account has numerous verbal and thematic connections backward into Genesis and even forward into Genesis after this, as well as some external connections like to the book of Ruth and so on. Now, by the end of chapter 38, Judah has an heir who perpetuates his line, which is the royal line, but it wasn't a straight course to get there. And so we do get a detail of his family, how that Judah married a woman of Canaan, the daughter of a man named Shua, and had three sons, Er, Onan, and Shelah. And Er married Tamar, but Er was a wicked man, and God killed him because of his sins. And we're not told what those were and don't have any idea what those were. Onan, then, his brother, was to marry the widow Tamar, and so that Er would have an heir for his inheritance. But Onan sinfully refused that, and he exploited the situation. God killed him because of his sins. So Shelah was then promised to Tamar, but she was never given to him after that he was grown. And so Tamar disguised herself and deceived Judah and ended up having twin sons by Judah. And Judah had condemned Tamar to be killed, but had to confess that he was worse in sin than she was. So the events of chapter 38 cover a couple of decades and end sometime before the brothers went down to Egypt to buy food during the famine. But it's important to see the beginning of Judah's change coming after his humiliation in this chapter, as that will be brought out even more as the book of Genesis continues on. Now, we come to chapter 39, and chapter 39 just rejoins Joseph's story from the end of chapter 37. His brothers had sold him to the Ishmaelite, to the Midianite merchants who sold him to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh's. And Joseph's story, now that we come back to it, is even it's even clearer. It is set in contrast now to this backdrop of the story in chapter number 38. And Joseph's story, as we follow along his path for a while, his story seems to be a succession of hardships. Joseph seems to be one who, just has a black cloud that follows him around, and whenever that something good seems to happen, there's something bad that seems to follow it. Now, Moses is very careful to show us how that these hardships are not Joseph's fault. Joseph is presented to us as a man of faith, as a man of pursuing righteousness. But the hardships further emphasize how that God was with Joseph. And peeking ahead to chapter number 50, these hardships also show how that God was guiding Joseph according to his purpose. So Joseph is a righteous sufferer, but every step downward that he takes is actually a step closer to blessing and exaltation and the saving of Israel. So this chapter begins the account of Joseph as a foreigner in Egypt, and he gains favor in this chapter only to end up in prison. So we want to look at this chapter in two parts. Verses 1 to 10, Joseph in charge, and in verses 11 to 23, where Joseph loses another coat. So let's look at verses 1 to 10, where Joseph is put in charge. Start here again with verses 1 and 2. And Joseph was brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, a captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him of the hands of the Ishmaelites, which had brought him down thither. And the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. So again, the account picks up right where chapter 37 left off. And Joseph is transported to Egypt, where the merchants were going to do business. And I know there's some mixing of Ishmaelites and Midianites in the account. And it's a little bit uncertain. Most likely, it seems that the reference would be that there was a joining of the two to the point that they were sort of synonymous with one another. But that's neither here nor there, really. Joseph is taken there by these merchants. They're on their way to Egypt to do their transactions, and Potiphar is here described as an officer of Pharaoh and as a captain of the guard, and he is an Egyptian. Now, Potiphar's exact position and his exact duties are somewhat uncertain, and there's a few different ideas about what those are. But what is certain is that he clearly was a high ranking person in Egypt. Not as high as Joseph would end up being, but he is nevertheless a very high ranking person in Egypt. Now, right away, we encounter what we're going to see a lot of in this chapter, and that's some of these authorial comments. And we've talked about these, how as you're reading the narrative from time to time, Moses includes these little descriptions. We saw it in the previous chapter when he tells us things that Judah was thinking that obviously we'd know otherwise we wouldn't know. And so here we have him adding just such a comment. And you see it at the beginning of verse 2. And the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man. The Lord was with Joseph. God was with him. That's actually stated 4 times in this chapter. Here in verse 2, again in verse 3, in verse 21, and in verse 23 at the end. So you can see that actually strikes a note that's going to run through this chapter, that God was with Joseph. So what is clear from the very beginning is that Joseph's success, and we also see a repetition of Joseph prospering or succeeding. Joseph's success is due to God's blessing. Now, Joseph is presented to us as a man of faith. He was obviously one that was a diligent and a conscientious worker. He was one that proved himself trustworthy and reliable, and we'll see those things coming out as we go along. But Moses is clear from the very start to make it known that whatever Joseph put his hand to, the Lord prospered it. So it is the blessing of the Lord and God's presence with him that is the success of Joseph in all of these different situations. But not only that, God is involved in each step for Joseph, and that is brought out very clearly in this chapter, whether that step seems positive or whether it seems negative. And of course, if we're familiar with the story of Joseph, then we realize that you can't just take a small picture and sort of from that extrapolate to where Joseph is going to end up. So he ends up in Potiphar's house, and he's a slave in his house. Well, you can't stop there. He gets promoted in Potiphar's house. Well, so then, he comes to a high position, probably the highest that a slave could in that situation, unless he were a slave to Pharaoh himself. But you can't stop there, because that's not the end of the story, and so on. We have to keep going. But every step of the way, whether it seems positive or seems negative, God is guiding Joseph, because God is with him. So now let's look at verses 3 to 6. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. And Joseph found grace in his sight, and he served him, and he made him overseer over his house, and all that he had he put into his hand. And it came to pass, from the time that he had made him overseer in his house, and over all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was upon all that he had in the house and in the field. And he left all that he had in Joseph's hand. And he knew not aught that he had, save the bread which he did eat. And Joseph was a goodly person and well favored. So much like what we saw with Jacob when he was in Paddan Aram and he was serving Laban there. The Lord was with him, and it was evident that the Lord was with him. So in the case of Jacob, Laban recognized that the Lord is with Jacob, and the things he puts his hands to are prospering, and my house is prospering because of him, for his sake. So this is the same realization that Potiphar has, that God is with Joseph. He's prospering the things that he puts his hand to, and Potiphar's house is being blessed because of this as well. So God's presence with Joseph outside of the land of Canaan showed once again that he was no land-bounded deity like the gods of the Canaanites, the gods of the mountains and the gods of the seas and the gods of the plains and the God of this nation and the God of that nation and all these other gods that they saw. And we learn again that Yahweh, he is God, and he's a God above all gods, and he is a God everywhere and at all times. Now, God's presence with Joseph also meant that he succeeded at what he did, and it was evident to others that God was with him. And that's the point here in these verses, that Potiphar is recognizing this. So once again, we see the promises of God to Abraham and were confirmed to Isaac and confirmed to Jacob. We see those promises again being fulfilled. He promised to bless Abraham, to make him a blessing, and to bless those that blessed him. And he confirmed this to Isaac, confirms this to Jacob, and now we see this promise again being fulfilled, and here it is being fulfilled through Joseph. Now it seems rather quickly that Joseph was made the head slave and the steward of Potiphar's house, when in reality, of course, there's probably several years that passes by during the time that Joseph is serving Potiphar in his house. So he is entrusted, we are told, with everything, meaning that he worked without supervision, and he attended to all that was in the house and in the field. So not only did the work succeed, whatever the task was that Joseph was given, and whether it was management or whatever the case may be, not only did his work succeed, but Joseph also proved himself trustworthy and reliable, and to be entrusted with the stewardship of a great house. So everything was entrusted to him, and it says here, Potiphar knew not except the bread that he did eat. And essentially what this means is that everything was entrusted to Joseph to oversee and to take care of, except for just very personal matters, which Potiphar would have still attended to, like the bread he was going to eat that day or whatever the case may be. So his responsibilities were such that Potiphar no longer knew the extent of his own household affairs. So that is how much trust that Joseph had gained in Potiphar. It's how much success that his work had enjoyed. Now we get another authorial comment here that we see it at the end of verse number 6, that Joseph was a goodly person and well favored. So there's a comment that's added here about Joseph's appearance. So apparently, what we're being told is that Joseph was a handsome man. Joseph was an overall attractive man. And the very same thing was said about his mother, Rachel, in chapter 29 and verse number 17. And it is interesting to note that it is a phrase that is only ever used of one other man in the Bible. And that, of course, would be David. Now, this statement, though, this observation that Joseph was obviously a very attractive man, he had, and again, several years had no doubt passed in Potiphar's house, and he has grown to be a strapping young man, or whatever sort of description you want to give to that these days. That he had grown to be that, and obviously that sets us up for what happens next. So now we look at verses 7 to 10. And it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph, and she said, Lie with me. But he refused, and said unto his master's wife, Behold, my master wotteth not what is with me in the house, and he hath committed all that he hath to my hand. There's none greater in this house than I, neither hath he kept back anything from me but thee, because thou art his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? And it came to pass, as she spake to Joseph day by day, that he hearkened not unto her to lie by her or to be with her. So, having now given this setup of Joseph in Potiphar's house, so the merchants come to Egypt, and Potiphar buys Joseph as to be a slave in his house, and he would have just bought him as a common slave. And so he is put into the house. He's put into work, and it pretty quickly he proves himself and he proves his worth, and he's blessed, and everything that he does seems to prosper, and Potiphar's house seems to be profiting from it. And so over the process of time, he gets up to the point where he's the head steward over the house, and all of Potiphar's affairs are essentially in his charge, except for very few things and very personal things that Potiphar would have retained to himself. So Joseph is seeming to be doing very well in Potiphar's house for several years. So again, this seems to be a positive step. But over time, he was noticed by Potiphar's wife. And we're told how that she began to lust for Joseph and determined to have him. And so she actually approaches him to seduce him, but Joseph refuses her advances. And Joseph explained that he could not sin against Potiphar nor against God. So when he gives all this description about his responsibilities in the household and the trust that Potiphar has put in him, in essence, Joseph is explaining all the more reason why he cannot violate the trust that Potiphar has placed in him. And not only that, he can't do such a wicked thing and sin against God. Now, the word for wickedness is the same as was used of Judah's firstborn son, Er, in chapter 38 and verse number 7. And that's what Joseph refers to this word. And again, we noticed in the previous chapter how that word is used in connection with judgment, in association with judgment, when men are guilty of wickedness or evil or sin before God. Now, Joseph refuses, and no matter how convenient that it might be, or how willing that Potiphar's wife was, Joseph knew that it was adultery, and he refused to engage in it. But of course, she wasn't easily defeated or deterred, and she persisted day after day, we're told, to try to seduce Joseph, but he held strong in his refusal. And of course, now she has become frustrated and even more determined, and maybe even somewhat desperate. And that brings us into the next part where Joseph loses another coat. Begin here in verses 11 to 15. And it came to pass about this time that Joseph went into the house to do his business, and there was none of the men of the house there within. And she caught him by his garment, saying, Lie with me. And he left his garment in her hand and fled and got him out. And it came to pass, when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and was fled forth, that she called unto the men of her house and spake unto them, saying, See, He hath brought in an Hebrew unto us to mock us. He came in unto me to lie with me, and I cried with a loud voice. And it came to pass, when he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried, that he left his garment with me and fled and got him out. So Potiphar's wife did not give up. Moses has indicated to us that she was continually trying to get at Joseph. And here he goes to this time when there was a perfect opportunity that she seized. She found Joseph alone, and she grabs hold of him. She's trying to force the issue. And notice that Joseph, he doesn't try to reason with her. It doesn't seem anything. That he fled is what we're told. In other words, he quickly recognized the situation for what it was and got away just as quick as he could. So he ran out of the house. He left his coat or his outer cloak behind, and she's got a hold of it in her hand. And then we see something about the character of Potiphar's wife, even more than what we've seen to this point. She's obviously very quick thinking, and she's obviously very shrewd. And she realizes quickly the situation now that she has in front of her. And so she calls for the other servants of the house immediately. And she explains this false accusation to them about what happened. And here she is holding Joseph's coat as the condemning evidence. Now, notice what she does. She says, he's brought in a Hebrew unto us to mock us. Now, we also know from the account concerning the Egyptians that they thought that the Hebrews, being the shepherds that they tended to be, the pastoral type of people that they were an abomination to the Egyptians. So she already appeals to a sense of race and ethnic tensions that could have existed to get them on her side. Well, surely he's guilty because he's a Hebrew. So surely he's guilty. So she's very shrewd in that she has quickly called these other servants, because now they also are able to function as witnesses on her behalf, though they didn't actually witness anything. But yet she has her evidence, she's got her witness. So once again, Joseph's coat is used to deceive someone about him, just as it was in the case with his father, and now it is used to falsely accuse him of attempting to force Potiphar's wife. Let me go to verses 16 to 20. And she laid up his garment by her until his Lord came home. And she spake unto him according to these words, saying, the Hebrew servant which thou hast brought unto us came in unto me to mock me. And it came to pass, as I lifted up my voice and cried, that he left his garment with me and fled out. And it came to pass, when his master heard the words of his wife, which she spake unto him, saying, after this manner did thy servant to me, that his wrath was kindled. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were bound, and he was there in the prison. So now that she has established her story and her witnesses, we're told that she waits for Potiphar to come home. And in her artful deception here, notice how she deflects responsibility. And again, proves herself to be very, very shrewd. So she refers again to the Hebrew servant, and the word there is ebed, it's slave, it's equivalent to the doulos in the Greek. This Hebrew slave. You brought this Hebrew slave in to mock us, appealing not only to a sense of ethnic pride or ethnic bigotry that might exist in Potiphar, but also she's shifting blame to Potiphar. Now he's the one responsible. He brought this man into the house that has now perpetrated this alleged act. And so now he stands in responsibility for this act. And she repeats her presentation of the evidence with Joseph's coat. And of course, we're told that Potiphar was enraged. He was enraged by this story, and he seizes Joseph to throw him in prison. Now, Potiphar, being the high-ranking person that he was in Egypt, we're told that he puts him into prison, and that he specifically puts him into prison where the royal prisoners are kept. And of course, we know that this is also providential, because it's going to bring Joseph into contact with those close servants of Pharaoh a little later on, setting up what is to follow. Then we look at verses 21 to 23, the end of the chapter. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners that were in the prison, and whatsoever they did there, he was the doer of it. The keeper of the prison looked not to anything that was under his hand, because the Lord was with him, and that which he did, the Lord made it to prosper. So we are reminded at the outset that the Lord, Yahweh, was with Joseph. Notice how that Joseph's put into prison, but God was with him. In other words, God had not forsaken Joseph because he had achieved promotion to the highest place in Potiphar's house, this high-ranking official in Egypt. He wasn't forsaken because he went from there to the prison. No, God was with him. God was with him going even to the prison. And notice also what it says here, that he was with Joseph, and in verse 21, and he showed him mercy. And yes, of course, that is the Hebrew term chesed, referring to that covenant mercy that the Lord showed to Joseph. So when Potiphar's wife figured that she couldn't get what she wanted from Joseph, it seems that she was done with him. She's willing to forsake him, to have him, be gone from her. But God did not forsake Joseph. And even though Potiphar had been so pleased with Joseph's work, he's angry and ready to throw him into prison. But again, God did not forsake Joseph. And that it was his covenant mercy shows that God's being with Joseph and guiding him through all of these steps, that God is acting according to his covenant promises in the matter of Joseph in prison. And if you think back, God promised to Abraham that they would go into a country that was not theirs, and they would be there 400 years, but he would bring them out again. And of course, all of this is leading up to that, and all of this is an integral part of them going down into Egypt in the first place, saving the nation, but also fulfilling the promises that God made to Abraham. So God was with Joseph, and God showed him his covenant, loyal mercy, and love. Now, once again, we read how that God blessed Joseph. I mean, at some point, it seems like that, will Joseph just be discouraged and want to quit? I mean, he's thrown into a pit by his brothers. He's then sold as a slave in the house. He works his way up to the top as far as he can go in the house of Potiphar. Now he's back down worse than zero. He's in prison. But nevertheless, God's still with him. Joseph has not lost his faith. He has not lost his trust and reliance in God. And again, the things that he does are prospered. And the blessings of God on Joseph are evident even to the warden of the prison. He recognizes it with Joseph, and he entrusts him with responsibilities in the prison. Joseph succeeded so well and proved himself trustworthy so that the warden didn't even need to supervise Joseph. And Joseph continued to succeed. He continued to prosper in the things that he was doing. So as we think about this chapter, I don't think there's any way to escape the primary lesson in this chapter, the faithfulness of God to his own word and to those who trust in him. Again, we have this repetition that God was with him. We have it repeated how that God blessed and prospered Joseph. We have it repeated how that God blessed Potiphar because of Joseph. And then God blesses the prison keeper because of Joseph, and so on. So God was with him. God made him succeed. Now, if I gave you that description, today we're going to learn about a man that God was always with and that God blessed him so that he succeeded in everything that he did. would your mind immediately go to, oh, that's a man in prison? No, that's not where our mind would go. But nevertheless, that is the case of Joseph. I mean, we come up with a very different picture of what God being with us and God making us to succeed looks like. But this is what it really looks like. This is the image that Moses has given us through the inspiration of the Spirit and what really happened in the life of Joseph. So Israel on the plains of Moab needed to understand that God being with them didn't mean that everything was going to be easy. It didn't mean that they would never suffer. It didn't mean that they would never endure pain. As Joseph goes from the pit to slavery to prison, that doesn't seem like an upward track. It doesn't seem like a path that we would willingly want to follow. And I'm sure that it's not the path Joseph would have picked for himself. When Joseph had those dreams and he sees his brother sheaves bowing down to his, and then he sees the sun and the moon and the 11 stars bowing down to him. And so Joseph thinks, well, I'm going to be at an exalted position where even my family is going to be subjugated to me. And how are you going to get there, Joseph? Well, I think I'll be, thrown in a pit and my father think that I'm dead and then become a slave and then end up in prison. That's not the way that Joseph would have planned to get there if God was relying on Joseph to make the plan. But God already had the plan. God already had the purpose. And that is the primary lesson that is being taught in this chapter. And also, Joseph is presented to us in this chapter completely as a faithful man. God is with him. God's blessing him. God is protecting him. But that certainly didn't mean that Joseph just won everything and never suffered. Joseph's faith and commitment to righteousness caused him to refuse wickedness, and at least in the short term, got him into more trouble. And Israel needed to understand that. And that's something that we also need to understand today. Committing ourselves to the Lord, committing ourselves to what He says is right, may very well mean a lot of losses for us. It may mean the loss of friends. It may mean the loss of jobs. It may mean the loss of opportunities. It may mean the loss of family. It may mean the loss of freedom. It may even mean the loss of our lives. But we need to know that God will be with us. And that doesn't mean that everything will go the way that we want. But ultimately, the gain is far greater than any loss that we could suffer. That's exactly the testimony that the Apostle Paul gave. And when you read about his life and you read about all of the things that he suffered and all the imprisonments and all the beatings and being stoned and left for dead outside the city and all of these things that happened in Paul's life. And he's the same man that said, these are just temporary and light afflictions in our lives. And they're working in us a far more weighty and eternal glory. And they're not even able to be compared to the glory that awaits us. And so Joseph, just as we see in this chapter, and we'll see as we continue looking at Joseph's life, was one that understood that there was a greater gain. All right, that's all of our message for this evening. We will close with a hymn.